society more broadly.
So speaking about the nature of self, you've been an outspoken proponent of pro-life. Can we start by you trying to steelman the case for pro-choice, that abortion is not murder, and a woman's right to choose is a fundamental human right, freedom?
So I think that the only way to steelman the pro-choice case is to, and be ideologically consistent, is to suggest that there is no interest in the life of the unborn that counterweighs at all freedom of choice. So what that means is, we can take the full example, or we can take sort of the partial example. So if we take the full example, what that would mean is that up until point of birth, which is sort of the Democratic Party platform position, that a woman's right to choose ought to extend for any reason whatsoever up to point of birth. The only way to argue that is that bodily autonomy is the only factor. There is no countervailing factor that would ever outweigh bodily autonomy. That would be the strongest version of the argument. Another version of that argument would be that the reason that bodily autonomy ought to weigh so heavily is because women can't be the equals of men if the vicissitudes of biology are allowed to decide their futures. Right? If pregnancy changes women in a way that it doesn't change men, it's a form of sex discrimination for women to ever have to go through with pregnancy, which is an argument that was made by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, kind of. Those are the arguments. The kind of softer version is the more, I would say, emotionally resonant version of the argument, which is that bodily autonomy ought to outweigh the interests of the fetus up till point X. And then people have different feelings about what point X looks like. Is it up to the point of viability? Is it up to the point of the heartbeat? Is it up to 12 weeks or 15 weeks? And that really is where the American public is, where the American public is, broadly speaking, not state by state, where there are various really, really varied opinions. But like broadly speaking, it seems like the American public by polling data wants somewhere between a 12 and 15 week abortion restriction. And they believe that up until 12 or 15 weeks, there's not enough there to not be specific, but to be kind of how people feel about it, to outweigh a woman's bodily autonomy. And then beyond that point, then there's enough of an interest in the life of the preborn child. It's developed enough that now we care about it enough that it outweighs a woman's bodily autonomy.
What's the strongest case for pro-life in your mind?
I mean, the strongest case for pro-life is that from conception, a human life has been created. It is a human life with potential. That human life with potential now has an independent interest in its own existence.
If I may just ask a quick question. So conception is when a sperm fertilizes an egg?
Yes.
Okay. Just to clarify
Yes.
the biological beginning of what conception means.
I mean, because that is the beginning of human life. Now, there are other standards that people have drawn, right? Some people say implantation in the uterus. Some people will suggest viability, some people brain development or heart development. But the clear dividing line between a human life exists and a human life does not exist is the biological creation of an independent human life with its own DNA strands and et cetera, which happens at conception. Once you acknowledge that there is that independent human life with potential, and I keep calling it that because people sometimes say potential human life. It's not a potential human life. It's a human life that is not developed yet to the full extent that it will develop. Once you say that, and once you say that it has its own interest, now the burden of proof is to explain why bodily autonomy ought to allow for the snuffing out of that human life if we believe that human life ought not to be killed for quote unquote no good reason. You have to come up with a good reason, right? The burden of proof is now shifted. Now, you will find people who will say, well, the good reason is that it's not sufficiently developed to outweigh the mental trauma or emotional trauma that a woman goes through if, for example, she was raped or the victim of incest. Okay, and that is a fairly emotionally resonant argument, but it's not necessarily dispositive. You can make the argument that just because something horrific and horrible happened to a woman does not rob the human life of its interest in life. One of the big problems in trying to draw any line for the self-interest of life in the human life is that it's very difficult to draw any other line that doesn't seem somewhat arbitrary. You say that independent heartbeat, people have pacemakers. If you say brain function, people have various levels of brain function as adults. If you say viability, babies are not viable after they are born. If I left a newborn baby on a table and did not take care of it, it would be dead in 2 days. So, once you start getting into sort of these lines, it starts to get very fuzzy very quickly. And so if you're looking for sort of a bright line moral rule, that would be the bright line moral rule. And that's sort of the pro-life case.
Well, there's still mysterious, difficult scientific questions of things like consciousness. So what to you does the question of consciousness how does it come into play into this debate?
So I don't believe that consciousness is the sole criterion by which we judge the self-interest in human life. So we are unconscious a good deal of our lives, right? That does not, we will be conscious again, right? When you're unconscious, when you're asleep, for example, presumably your life is still worth living. If somebody came in and killed you, that'd be a serious moral quandary at the very least.
But the birth of consciousness, the lighting up of the flame, the initial lighting up of the flame, there does seem to be something special about that, and it's a mystery of when that happens.
Well, I mean, Peter Singer makes the case that basically self-consciousness doesn't exist until you're 2.5. Right. So he says that even infanticide should be okay. Right. He's the bioethicist over at Princeton. So you get into some real dicey territory once you get into consciousness. Also, the truth is that consciousness is more of a spectrum than it is a dividing line, meaning that there are people with various degrees of brain function. We don't actually know how conscious they are, and you can get into eugenic territory pretty quickly when we start dividing between lives that are worth living based on levels of consciousness and lives that are not worth living based on levels of consciousness.
Do you find it the aspect of women's freedom? Do you feel the tension between that ability to choose the trajectory of your own life versus the rights of the unborn child?
In one situation, yes. In one situation, no. If you've had sex with a person voluntarily, and as a product of that, you are now pregnant, no. You've taken an action with a perfectly predictable result. Even if you took birth control, this is the way that human beings have procreated for literally all of human existence. And by the way, also how all mammals procreate. So the idea that this was an entirely unforeseen consequence of your activity, I find I have less sympathy for you in that particular situation, because you could have made decisions that would not lead you to this particular impasse. In fact, this used to be the basis of marriage, right? Was when we were a apparently more terrible society, we used to say that people should wait until they get married to have sex, a position that I still hold. And the reason for that was because then if you have sex and you produce a child, then the child will grow up in a two-parent family with stability. So, you know, not a ton of sympathy there. When it comes to rape and incest, obviously heavy sympathy. And so that's why I think you see, statistically speaking, a huge percentage of Americans, including many pro-life Americans, people who consider themselves pro-life, would consider exceptions for rape and incest. One of the sort of dishonest things that I think happens in abortion debates is arguing from the fringes. This tends to happen a lot, is pro-choice activists will argue from rape and incest to the other 99.8% of abortions. Or you'll see people on the pro-life side argue from partial birth abortion to all of abortion. You actually have to take on sort of the mainstream case and then decide whether or not that's acceptable or not.
But to you, the exception, just ethically, without generalizing it, that is a valid ethically exception.
I don't hold that there should be an exception for rape or incest, because again, I hold by the bright line rule that once a human life with potential exists, then it has its own interest in life that cannot be curbed by your self-interest. The only exception that I hold by is the same exception that literally all pro-lifers hold by, which is the life of the mother is put in danger.
Such a tough topic, because if you believe that that's the line, then we're committing mass murder.
Well, or at least mass killing. So I would say that murder typically requires a level of mens rea that may be absent in many cases of abortion. Right? Because the usual follow-on question is, well, if it's murder, why not prosecute the woman? And the answer is because the vast majority of people who are having abortions don't actually believe that they're killing a person. Right? They have a very different view of what is exactly happening. So, you know, I would say that there are all sorts of interesting hypotheticals that come in to play when it comes to abortion, and you can play them any which way. But levels, let's put it this way, there are gradations of wrongs. I don't think that all abortions are equally blameworthy, even if I would ban virtually all of them. Right? I think that there are mitigating circumstances that make, while being wrong, some abortions less morally blameworthy than others. I think that, you know, there is I can admit a difference between killing a 2-week-old embryo in the womb and stabbing a 7-year-old in the face. Like I can recognize all that while still saying I think that it would be wrong to terminate a pregnancy.
Do you think the question of when life begins, which I think is a fascinating question, is a question of science or a question of religion?
I mean, when life begins, it's a question of science. When that life becomes valuable enough for people to want to protect it, is going to be a question that is beyond science. Science doesn't have moral judgments to make about the value of human life. This is one of the problems that Sam Harris and I have had this argument many times, and it's always kind of interesting, because Sam is of the opinion that you can get to ought from is, right? That science says is, therefore we can learn ought. So human flourishing is the goal of life. And I always say to him, I don't see where you get that from evolutionary biology. You can assume it. Just say you're assuming it, but don't pretend that is a conclusion that you can draw straight from biological reality itself, because obviously that doesn't exist in the animal world. For example, nobody assumes the innate value of every ant.
I think I know your answer to this, but let's test it, because I think you're going to be wrong. So there's a robot behind you. Do you think there will be a time in the future when it will be unethical and illegal to kill a robot because they will have sentience? My guess is you would say no, Lex. Because there's a fundamental difference between humans and robots, and I just want to get you on record because I think you'll be wrong.
I mean, it depends on the level of development, I would assume, of the robots. I mean, you're assuming a complexity in the robots that eventually imitates what we in the religious life would call the human soul.
Yes.
The ability to choose freely, for example.
Yes.
Which I believe is sort of the capacity for human beings.
The ability to suffer.
Yeah. If all of that could be proved and not programmed, meaning the freely willed capacity of a machine to do X, Y, or Z.
You could not pinpoint exactly where it happens in the program.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not deterministic.
Yeah.
Then it would raise serious moral issues, for sure. I'm not sure I know the answer to that question.
Are you afraid of that time?
I'm not sure I'm afraid of that time. I mean, it's any more than I'd be afraid if aliens arrived in the world and had these characteristics.
Well, there's just a lot of moral complexities, and they don't necessarily have to be in the physical space. They can be in the digital space. There's an increased sophistication and number of bots on the internet, including on Twitter. As they become more and more intelligent, there's going to be serious questions about what is our moral duty to protect ones that have or claim to have an identity.
And that'll be really interesting. Actually, what I'm afraid of is the opposite happening, meaning that people, the worst that should happen is that we develop robots so sophisticated that they appear to have free will, and then we treat them with human dignity. Yeah. That should be the worst that happens. What I'm afraid of is the opposite, is that we, if we're talking about this particular hypothetical, that we develop robots that have all of these apparent abilities, and then we dehumanize them, which leads us to also dehumanize the other humans around us, which you could easily see happening. The devaluation of life to the point where it doesn't really matter. I mean, people have always treated, unfortunately, newly discovered other humans this way. So I don't think there's actually a new problem. I think it's a pretty old problem. It'll just be interesting when it's made of human hands.
Yeah, it's an opportunity to either celebrate humanity or to bring out the worst in humanity. So the derision that naturally happens, like you said, with pointing out the other. Let me ask you about climate change. There's let's go from the meme